Have you ever noticed something strange about how we talk about generations? Boomers are constantly discussed. Millennials get analyzed to death. Gen Z is treated like some brand new cultural experiment everyone wants to study. But there's an entire generation sitting quietly in the middle that hardly gets mentioned at all. Generation X. Born roughly between 1965 and 1980, they're the people who seem to exist just outside the spotlight. They're the coworker who gets the job done without complaining. The parent who seems calm, maybe a little distant. The group that helped build the early internet, but rarely feels the need to broadcast their lives online. And what most people don't realize is that their psychology may be the most misunderstood of any generation alive today. Generation X grew up during the rise of the latch-key kid. Picture this. It's the late 1970s. You're 8 years old, school finishes, and you walk home alone because both of your parents are still at work. When you arrive, the house is empty. No smartphones, no security cameras, no quick way for anyone to check if you're okay. You unlock the door yourself. You make your own snack. You sit down at the kitchen table and do your homework while the house stays completely silent. And you wait. By the mid-1980s, researchers estimated that around 7 million children between the ages of 5 and 13 were regularly home alone after school. That kind of childhood quietly teaches you something powerful. Sometimes, there simply isn't anyone there to help. You figure things out yourself. Growing up like that didn't just make Gen X independent. It wired them to think about consequences very early in life. When their parents finally came home, there usually wasn't a long discussion about feelings. Rules were clear, and breaking them meant immediate consequences. Psychologists sometimes describe this kind of environment as a high-contingency childhood, where actions and results are tightly connected. If you did something wrong, the outcome followed quickly. Over time, that kind of upbringing trains the brain to constantly anticipate what might happen next, which may explain why many Gen X adults tend to think several steps ahead without even realizing it. But independence wasn't the only thing shaping them. Generation X also grew up watching the idea of stability slowly crack. They saw divorce rates climb through the 70s and 80s. They watched parents give decades of loyalty to companies, only to lose their jobs during waves of layoffs and restructuring. They were told that if you worked hard and followed the rules, life would reward you. Then they watched the rules change. Psychologists sometimes call this mindset defensive pessimism. Gen X simply calls it being realistic. It's not pure cynicism. It's more like emotional armor. They hope things work out, but they've also learned to expect that sometimes the rug gets pulled out from under you. That same mindset helps explain something else about them: their relationship with social media. Generation X grew up in a world where privacy was the default setting. If you embarrassed yourself as a teenager, maybe a few friends saw it, and that was the end of it. No viral videos, no permanent digital record. So the idea of broadcasting every detail of your life online doesn't feel exciting to many of them. It feels risky. It's not that they don't understand technology. They helped create the digital world we live in today. They just learned early on that the less people know about you, the safer you are. Another defining trait of Gen X is their sense of humor, sarcasm, irony, dry jokes delivered with a straight face. For many of them, humor became a kind of shield, and it makes sense when you consider the world they grew up in. This was the generation raised during the Cold War. Kids practiced duck and cover drills in school, preparing for nuclear war as if hiding under a desk might somehow save them. Adults spoke about the possibility of global catastrophe while also telling children everything was perfectly fine. Growing up in that kind of contradiction teaches you something unusual: how to hold two conflicting ideas at the same time. And sometimes the easiest way to deal with that tension is humor. But perhaps the most distinctive trait of Generation X is their approach to work. They rarely talk about it. They don't post motivational quotes about it. They just show up and do it. Many Gen Xers started working young. Paper routes before sunrise, bagging groceries, working fast food counters where you had to calculate change in your head if the register stopped working. These weren't glamorous first jobs. They were early introductions to responsibility. At 12 or 13 years old, some kids were responsible for delivering newspapers to entire neighborhoods. That experience shaped their outlook on work for life. After watching their parents lose jobs during corporate restructures, Gen X developed a very practical philosophy. They don't necessarily trust companies to be loyal, but they are deeply loyal to their own competence. They can't control whether layoffs happen, but they can control whether they're valuable enough that losing them would hurt. At the core of Gen X psychology is an interesting paradox. They are incredibly independent, yet they are also quietly supportive of others. They rarely ask for help themselves. After all, they've been figuring things out alone since childhood. But if someone else needs help, they tend to show up. No announcement, no social media post, just quiet support. Much of that comes from the friendships they formed growing up. When parents were working or absent, friends became the support system. Another unique trait is their relationship with authority. Gen X doesn't automatically respect titles. They respect competence. If someone proves they know what they're doing, Gen X will follow them without hesitation. But if someone is in charge purely because of status, yet lacks skill or knowledge, Gen X tends to have very little patience, and history gave them plenty of reasons to question authority. They grew up during events like Watergate, political scandals, and public health crises that showed institutions were far from perfect. Economically, they've also faced repeated disruptions. The younger end of the generation entered adulthood just as the dot-com bubble collapsed. Many of the older Gen X workers were in the middle of their careers when the 2008 financial crisis hit. Experiencing multiple economic shocks shaped their approach to money. Many Gen Xers build multiple income streams, not because they're naturally entrepreneurial, but because they've learned one simple lesson: nothing lasts forever. But that intense self-reliance can have a downside. Research shows that Gen X tends to ask for help less often during difficult times, not because they lack friends or support, but because asking sometimes feels like admitting failure. And their self-sufficiency even shaped how they learned. Before the internet, finding information took real effort. You searched through library card catalogs. You flipped through books hoping to find the answer to a single question. Because knowledge required time and effort to obtain, it often stuck in memory more deeply. And when things broke, you tried fixing them yourself. If your bike chain slipped off, you didn't watch a tutorial. You flipped the bike upside down, grabbed a wrench, and figured it out. That process built a quiet confidence that the physical world could be understood with patience and persistence. Now many Gen X parents are watching their children grow up in a completely different environment. Constant supervision, instant answers from the internet, lives documented through social media. They've tried to give their kids the attention they sometimes lacked, but part of them wonders if the world has become too protective. Because in the Gen X mindset, visibility often equals vulnerability. In many ways, Generation X may be the last generation that truly remembers what it feels like to be bored, to sit alone with your thoughts, to solve a problem without immediately searching for the answer online. They're not better than other generations. They are simply the product of a very specific moment in history. A time when the old world was fading and the digital world had not fully arrived. Generation X became the bridge between those two eras. And bridges rarely get attention. They simply stand there, holding everything together. And perhaps the most Gen X trait of all is not really caring whether anyone notices.